Afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Here we are. I'm very happy that Professor Van Veen is coming through crystal clearly. TOBiAS, hello, and welcome to class. Thank you so much for joining us. There you go. Yeah.
It's Sorry, I'm just playing with camera settings here.
I gotcha. It's good to see you virtually for the first time after corresponding for a bit, and I'm I'm happy that you're able to join us, and I'm happy that I'm able to finally be speaking with you via virtual voice. And class, you're in for a treat. We are joined by an absolute heavy hitter when it comes to the field of contemporary Afrofuturistic scholarship. TOBiAS Van Veen, as you guys have read, is a quite widely published author in the field of Afrofuturism and other areas. I believe he would self-describe as a critical theorist. Let me not project too much, but he'll go ahead and allow him to introduce himself a little bit better. But not only is Professor Van Veen, and TOBiAS, am I pronouncing it correctly? Van Veen, right?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay,
yeah.
All right. Okay, maybe Van Veen or something. All right, Van Veen is also an accomplished DJ, and I believe a producer. Do you do tracks, TOBiAS, or?
I do indeed make music as well. Yeah.
Right. We're talking about an ultimate 21st century Renaissance man, absent the Eurocentric baggage. Absent the Eurocentric baggage, everybody. TOBiAS, we've gone back and forth about Italian futurism and what we can conserve and what we can reject. You know the whole spiel. The class has gone through Armageddon Effect. That's a chapter in Afrofuturism 2.0. We have understood the basics of the argument, as we discussed yesterday, everyone. There we go with the book, all right? And they have the digital copy, okay? They all have it, all right? But we have all understood Professor Van Veen's conceptual analysis of aspects of Afrofuturism and Black futurology in terms of his identification of the operant concept of the Armageddon effect, the idea of already there or already modern when it comes to people of recent Africana descent and their experiences, historical experiences, especially in the Western world and all across the diaspora, and his explication of Armageddon in effect via his triple, let me remember the phrase, the three different types of responses to the Armageddon effect, which would be, what are they? Brittany, Damion, Flavienne, anybody? Will you remember from the article? What are these three archetypes?
The Afronaut, the Cosmic Messenger, the ancient Egyptian deity.
There you go. All right. Everything is recording fine. So let me just go ahead and stop it at that. I was rushing from the last class. It ends at 1:45, as you guys know, and I had a lot of questions. Let me stop and give the floor to Professor Van Veen. And TOBiAS, if you would be kind enough to, wow. All right, there you have some classic Sun Ra. Okay, and you guys have been introduced to Sun Ra. And also, everyone, let's be honest now. I'm not going to be upset. Have you all seen Space is the Place in full yet? Which I've assigned. If you haven't, let me know.
No.
Yes, no, don't worry about it.
I've seen half.
I'm like 90% there.
It's one of those things where you got to take a break for a second. Yeah, you got the pimp doing this. You got the Sun Ra talking that. You got the next thing you know, the pianist is being whatever.
I'm aware of the characters and what they represent.
Good, excellent, and especially in relation to Armageddon Effect and Sun Ra as the archetypical Egyptian deity type. Okay, now I'll give the floor to Professor Van Veen, and again, all of you now. Will we have something in the chat room really fast? No problem, Kai. Get on that, please. Yeah. So I got my all right, no problem. Exactly. All right. You guys all should have questions prepared as I ask, correct? Okay, so without further delay, Professor Van Veen, please feel free to go ahead and take it from there.
Good morning, everyone. Where I am this morning, so I'm still drinking my coffee. If you have a camera and are able to show yourself on the screen, that's fantastic. I'm looking at you all in gallery view, so I'm happy to see you. And if you want to raise your hand and speak up, that's great. What I'd love to do is open it up to a few questions, because this article goes off in a number of directions and references a number of concepts and fields. And it's worth me pointing out, actually, I mean, this article takes place within the context of a dissertation that addresses in other chapters Black feminism and Black female Afrofuturists. And when this chapter was excised and put into this volume, it had the unfortunate effect of propagating a Black male lineage of Afrofuturist archetypes. So the three kind of typologies that I'm playing with at the end are by no means definitive. Are they by no means the only three typologies that one could think of in terms of the development of Afrofuturist aesthetic praxis and arts, and are male biased, straight up. And there's actually a footnote. I realized I had actually put in a footnote, I think into the volume edition, just pointing out that this is three Black males, and I'm sort of following a certain musical or level of sonic effects in terms of tracing the relationship between Sun Ra and Coltrane and Hendrix in a particular period. And that's not clear at all in the chapter. So I don't want to deflect any criticism on that level, because I think as a scholar, I would not publish a piece like this that didn't have a much more balanced gender representation. And I've written extensively elsewhere on Janelle Monáe, Grace Jones, Octavia Butler. And now I'm working on some new stuff from artists like F.K. Twigs, for example. The other thing I'm more than happy to discuss is, hey, white scholar doing Black studies, what the fuck?
Glad you're saying it.
He brought it up. Well, all right, the elephant in the room. But hey, again, trust me.
Yeah.
One of the
Sorry, go on.
Hard pressed to find more expertise on Afrofuturism. But let me allow Professor Van Veen to explain it.
I mean, expertise aside, there's a lot of questions that should be asked when you encounter white scholars doing Black studies. And you should be paying hypercritical attention to their work in respect to what they're saying and how they're saying it. I mean, I kind of have a stock answer here. I'll kind of give a bit of a package, and this is often what I speak to at conferences and when I'm asked this question, but I'm happy to delve into it from any number of angles. But I've been a house and techno DJ since the early 1990s. I'm an old school anarchist raver on the West Coast, throwing like outdoor renegades and break-in warehouse parties. And my music of choice was Detroit techno and Chicago acid house. When I went to buy records in the early 90s in the record shop, there was this dusty bin that no one paid attention to in Vancouver, BC, Canada, and it said Detroit on it. And I went, what's this? And I started going through Jeff Mills, Underground Resistance, Axis Records, Derek May, Juan Atkins, Model 500, Drexia. This stuff grabbed my attention. I didn't know anything about it. Same with a lot of the Chicago acid house, which was much more widely popular, sort of squelchy acid 303 sound. But I got really into this. I started faxing the record labels, because that's what you did back in the day. There'd be like a fax number on the 12-inch, getting their information, getting their releases. And often they would send out these press releases that were totally conceptual and filled with like really outer space Black nationalist press releases. That's the only way I can describe it. Like the stuff that I would get from like Jeff Mills and Underground Resistance was just like, what is this? And at that point, there was really no terminology to describe this. So I was brought in at that level as like a DJ, and I started talking to the artists, and I started talking to the labels, and I started DJing it, throwing events around it, bringing people in to the West Coast, acting as a curator and promoter. And it wasn't until many years later when I was in university, because I started doing this when I was 16, that I had a professor tell me, because I gave a little presentation on like Detroit techno, and he was like, you should write about this. I didn't get around to actually really doing that until much later when I really thought about what I wanted to do for my PhD dissertation. And at that point, I had already written significantly around electronic dance music culture and rave culture in the context of subcultural studies, cultural studies, critical theory, philosophy of technology, and philosophy of race. And at that point, I had been involved with the nascent Afrofuturist community. So there was a listserv, Afrofuturism.net listserv that existed from the mid-ish 90s to the early 2000s. And that was organized by Paul D. Miller, DJ Spooky, whom I still know and work with from time to time, and Alondra Nelson, who put out the social text issue on Afrofuturism in 2000. Here it is. A special issue on Afrofuturism on 2000, which for a long time was the only journal publication on Afrofuturism, like for a long time, like 15 years or so or something.
Yeah.
So there was this big gap. Like there was a lot of discussion on Afrofuturism in the 90s, particularly around the work of Kojwo, like Kojwo Shun. Here's Is More Brilliant Than the Sun, the original edition, has like a non-standard cover. The way it's printed is really insane. It's all like record blurbs, the way he printed it. It's like a series of A-side, B-side, like commentaries. Totally not. You can see how marked up my book is here too. So I looked at Afrofuturism and I went, this is something I've been involved in for a very long time. It intersects what I'm interested around dance music cultures and subcultural politics. But as a philosopher, as a trained philosopher, a Western philosopher, but very much a Western philosopher who has been trained in deconstruction. So I've been trained by Derridians and I've been trained by Deleuzians. So if you follow your Deleuze and Guattari and you come across that kind of thought, especially in post-humanism around interdependent ecological, cultural, non-human actant networks, stuff like that, Bruno Latour, that kind of thing, as well as philosophy of race. And I started getting deep into critical race theory and the post-humanist critique of humanism, of the human, of white Enlightenment humanism. And I began to have this sort of realization when I was a grad student that everything that I'd been taught in mainstream philosophy was based upon the premise of the white Enlightenment human. And because I come out of rave culture, because I come out of this sort of anarchist, esoteric, quasi-occult background, like I'm Burning Man culture through and through. I had far more interest in like the pre-Socratics and where they got their knowledge from, right? And they were all trained in Alexandria. They were trained in Kemet, in Egypt, Black Egypt. And then when I went and did my class on Hegel, and we skipped over the introduction where Hegel dismisses Africa and dismisses Egypt as not being part of, Hegel, if you ever read Hegel, the German philosopher Hegel from the early 19th century, famous philosopher, theorist of dialectics, of historical dialectics, but he's a through and through racist. He has to somehow exclude Egypt from Africa in order to make the case that the birthplace of Western philosophy, which is in Egypt, nonetheless somehow isn't Black. And he gets worse than that. If you read the introduction, he basically argues that the peoples of the African continent have no religion, no law, no philosophy, and no governed society. They are savages. And he uses this in a philosophical justification for the elevation of other cultures in kind of a world historical dialectic with Africa at the bottom and Germany at the top. So this shit is baked into Western philosophy at a deep level, and I was never taught that. And when I started really digging into this, it made me angry. It made me really, really angry that I wasn't taught this and that we weren't critically analyzing the social cultural, not even beliefs, but this is baked into the philosophy of Hegel. And then when you look at the philosophers who come after, they've all got to, the way these white Enlightenment philosophers, Kant, to a degree Rousseau, although Rousseau's totally problematic around the idea of the noble savage. He gives a lot more attention, but still it's a mess in like Rousseau, really. Heidegger who infamously was a member of the Nazi Party during his rectorship of Freiburg University in the 1930s. He did renounce it, but what led him there? Right? What led him there? What led Hegel to this place? And I don't think it's an answer to say, well, that's just the way it was back then, because there were other philosophers who were not like this, like Spinoza in like the Netherlands, for example. And in a more contemporary example with Heidegger teaching in the early 20th century, World War II, leading up to World War II, you have the entire Frankfurt School in Germany, Benjamin, Adorno, Horkheimer, who were calling out what the Nazis were doing, who were calling out the kind of racist practices that they saw around them.
And if I could, just for 10 seconds, Professor, we have John.
Yeah, I know I'm off topic.
John Stuart Mill is on the syllabus, who, as you see clearly, and we will broach it in a few weeks, who was corresponding and wrote on the Negro question, which at the time was the N-word was quite different, who was a white British philosopher, an empiricist, who was literally sketching an early Afrocentric history of Western philosophy. But again, rarer compared to the Western philosophers who Professor Van Veen has correctly identified as being deeply steeped in anti-Black and overall racist attitudes. Excuse me.
Yeah, straight up. So, yeah, John Stuart Mill is fantastic. And then another contemporary in the 20th century, to a large degree, would be Sartre. Sartre's essay around Black Orpheus, I can't remember the title at this very moment, but it's discussed by Leopold Senghor, Frantz Fanon. It's an excellent piece, actually. It's still discussed to this day. So there are alternatives. It doesn't mean for me that I throw Hegel out with the bathwater in terms of methodology, dialectics, a lot of the ideas that he brings up, they're great. But the structure, his world historical structure, we don't need that. But it means then that as philosophers, we have other questions to answer. What is the human? What does it mean to be human? Do we have different cultural articulations of what it means to be human? Like we enter into problems with cultural relativism, right? What's a culture? Where are the boundaries? And this, I mean, when I was taught cultural relativism around these questions, there's always this idea that there was a culture and, there were almost like static things that kind of interacted with each other. And I just went, yeah, but look at the history of the past 400 years around the colonization of North America. How do we understand the question of the human and what it means to be human? The very basis of Western Enlightenment philosophy, the subject, the rational subject, the revolutionary subject. How do we understand that when this history is built through the extermination and genocide of indigenous peoples, and when it's built through the colonization of the continent through forced labor, when it's built through the triangular trade of industrialized slavery? So contained in this article are several kernel arguments that you'll see elsewhere. I don't mention it in this massive article, but a lot of the central premises here are those that you'll find in Black Marxism, like Cedric Robinson, C.L.R. James. I'm making an argument deep here that the birth of Western philosophy, like white Enlightenment philosophy, like the idea of a rational subject, and the birth of capitalism and the birth of slavery are all intertwined at the same moment. You can't have one without those others. Capitalism necessitates slavery. And this is a hard argument here. This is the quote unquote Marxist argument. And also, typically, white Enlightenment philosophy has pointed to the French Revolution as the birthplace of like modernity, where the French revolutionary subject is considered to be the first modern subject. I would argue that the birth of modernity begins with the first industrialized slave. But, back in the 17th century, 1600s, if not earlier, because that's when you have the birthplace of the banking industry and the insurance industry in London, in the UK, that would insure the ships that would go to the west coast of Africa, pick up enslaved Africans, and then bring them to North America and South America and the Caribbean, and then sail back to London. That's why it's the triangular trade. The boats did this, right? And what's really important to understand is the role of finance capital in this. You are insuring humans as cargo. So all the language in here around the subject $, that's a bit of a play. That's to like think about how subjectivity gets reduced to pure capital here, like what happens. But that's always an impure reduction. It's not like people themselves lose their, their subjectivity. But something else happens here. Something else happens. So Afrofuturism, it's a bit of a response to this long history, but it's not just reactive. It's not just reactive, and this chapter doesn't quite get into this, but it's also a proactive reinterpretation and remix of West African traditions, cultures, musics, rhythms. And I say West African for a second, but given what we understand now of the way that enslaved Africans were brought across the continent from various places, this is also like a real melange of influences too. But primarily West African practices is what we see in the Caribbean and North America in terms of all the interesting things we see in Afrofuturism, like hoodoo, voodoo, like riding the loa, like different religious practices and like rituals that are also transmitted through Afrofuturist artists and praxis.
TOBiAS.
TOBiAS.
TOBiAS, Jamaicans say,
Yeah. Particularly in the work of Janelle Monáe today. If you watch her Many Moons video, it's full of it. So let me stop there. That's just a bit of like perspective and justification. I'm an unemployed sessional, by the way. When you write things like this, take on your dissertation committee and challenge the basis of Western philosophy and start calling philosophers racist, you don't get hired within the power structure that easily. I'll be straight up. Like the stakes of this are real at the level of employment. But I never entered academia for pure employment. Luckily, I have other marketable skills that are paying my bills. I'm editing podcasts. But I saw this as like, if I'm here and going to do like a dissertation and a PhD in something around Western philosophy, and I have 2 doctorates. I have a doctorate in philosophy and communication studies, critical theory, critical media studies. It's got to be real. Like we got to start speaking to some real issues. So I'm happy to say that now there's a lot more discussion and field around this. I mean, what's happened with Afrofuturism since I published this and my dissertation in 2013 is the field has exploded, right? And films have come out like Black Panther, and the term has like come back into currency. And, it makes sense. It like speaks to what's happening today. So one of the issues that I put out to show this before I hand it over to your questions, this is the special issue of TOBiAS, Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies. This cover is by John Jennings. John Jennings is the Black comics artist who, he has a whole number of his own characters, but he's recently been doing the first graphic novel adaptations of Octavia Butler's work. So he did the graphic novel adaptation of Kindred, and he just finished Parable of the Sower. John's fantastic. So he did the cover for a TOBiAS issue. And I edited this issue with Ronaldo Anderson, who is the co-editor of the Afrofuturism 2.0 volume. So Ray and I have had the chance to work together on a few levels. Ray is the founder of the Black Speculative Arts Movement as kind of an umbrella organization to encompass Afrofuturist artists and producers and writers and so forth, throwing events and conferences and things. And this issue in particular is called Black Lives, Black Politics, Black Futures. So the connection is really specific between Black politics, Black Lives Matter, and Black futurism. For us, these things are inseparable. Okay, Afrofuturism is not apolitical or just artists. This is part of the sphere of Black revolutionary practice. And part of what Black revolutionary practice means is that if it's going to work, it's got to suck up white people too. And here's like the last little thing I'll say about this, because when I went to write my dissertation, I was not sure if I should be writing about this. I had a lot of internal debate. And I read a book by Ray Chow called The Protestant Ethnic. And this book's about ethnicity and race. She's a great philosopher of race. And in the introduction, she says, and this is her words, she says, look, as long as ethnic studies is always, like if ethnic studies is just this independent department within the university and it hires people of color, it allows critical race theory to remain segregated within the academy, right? And she uses the word ghettoized. Like, oh, we need an ethnic studies hire. I know, well, or we need a person of color in our department to diversify it. So we'll hire someone to do ethnic studies because people of color, all that they do is talk about ethnicity, right? Right. So that's one trap. As a person of color, you can study and publish on whatever the hell you want to. You don't have to talk about ethnicity. But that's also vice versa. It's not until white people in the academy start talking about race and critical race studies as part of their teaching of any critical humanities field that structural racism changes, right? To change structural racism, you need white people changing, right? And we need to desegregate ethnic studies and critical race studies. So that's where I'm kind of coming from. But it's going to be a long series of changes. And for the record, I fully support all affirmative action and representation-based hiring policies. I don't expect to get hired in an ethnic studies or Black studies or Africana studies department. And that's okay. It's not about me that way, right? I'm trying to get hired in media studies and communication studies. And I'm talking about the politics of hiring here because this is real shit. I mean, this is about race. This is about representation. This is about hiring. This is about, the academy. And Afrofuturism is by no means an established discourse. This is really like pushing the boundaries of what constitutes philosophy and of what constitutes the way we do philosophy. And the very fact, this entire chapter, if you notice, this entire chapter, all the white philosophers are either footnoted in just an endnote or in brackets. Intentional. All my primary cites in here are Black artists and Black philosophers. And I did this throughout the entire dissertation. I flipped it. All the primary sources in here are Black scholars. And there's actually justification for this at the beginning of the chapter in terms of this impure conceptual grammar. And I even take to task Paul Gilroy, who says there's an absence of conceptual grammar to adequately describe Afrofuturist cultural production. So throughout, I play with this idea of what constitutes a void or an absence. Because often when someone says, oh, there's an absence there or a void, usually means they haven't looked deep enough, or that they're constrained by disciplinary or conceptual boundaries within academia. And they don't look at the artists themselves to provide those concepts. So in that way, I'm very much a Deleuzian. Like I'm looking for precepts within the existing world around me. Okay. I'm happy to address any questions you might have that could be absolutely as basic as you'd like. Like, what does this mean? What does this sentence mean? Yeah, I'll open up the floor a bit.
Okay, everyone. So I would like you to join me in thanking Professor Van Veen for the introduction and the orientation of his, disciplinary background, his personal background, and on the one hand, a kind of reminder or review of some of the philosophical orientations that we've discussed, and on the other, an introduction to some of the different approaches to philosophy, global philosophy, or Western philosophy, Africana philosophy, and how at the intersection of philosophy, Africana and Black studies, ethnic studies, as TOBiAS has mentioned, and how productive, and how rich the field can be. So again, I hope that you have your questions ready. And if you could, please address them to Professor Van Veen. And yeah, let's go ahead and continue the conversation.
Okay, so I guess I'll ask something. More towards the end of the article, when you get into the chronopolitics, what I guess it reminds me of is, this seems to have been written before what I'm about to mention comes up, but would you say that even the concept of something like chronopolitics is being pushed to the forefront of American attention at the moment in terms of something like the 1619 Project, and not in the big political mess of things, and not in what they may or may not have right or wrong, or the biases that come with that, but just the fact that people want to recontextualize the way that American history is taught, and the pushback against it. We're sort of experiencing that even right now as we speak, that entire concept. I thought that was really interesting. I know that's a big question.
I think it's a great observation.
It kind of answers itself in that, and it's in like what you were mentioning, that even when you wrote this, that there was a lot of pushback to what you wrote and how you wrote it and who you referenced and how you referenced them. That it seems to be that there's a push to hold on to that very traditional based, idealized version of how we interpret the events that happen, especially in this country and the formation of this country. And yeah, it's not really a question, but that's what it made me think of when I was reading through that. And I know maybe at the time when you wrote it, it wasn't necessarily about that, but it almost seems predictive of the want to recontextualize American history.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it'd be a great question to look at chronopolitics as a concept. This would be a great paper, right? And then apply that to something like the 1619 Project and think about how it's revising history. I mean, the 1619 Project is fantastic. I mean, it's amazing. It also is part of a lineage of such projects and critical revisions of history that have come out of Black studies, including the very formation of Black studies in the 1960s to address questions like this. When I was writing it, I mean, I immersed myself in Afrocentrism. So the work of like Molefi Kereya-Sante Jr., for example, Malena Karanga. So Kajwa Shun's article, which I'm just riffing off of here, I'm formally developing Kajwa's thought, more or less. I mean, he's got the brainchild of the idea. He's very creative and imaginative, and he leaves a lot to be developed in his work. So I just sort of picked up this piece and started developing the idea of chronopolitics. But he really points out how Afrofuturism and Afrocentrism are very similar. They're very aligned in that they both undertake historical revisionism for a reason, because history has been whitewashed. It's been written by the white victors, right? So we get that. And what this article points out a little bit is the entwinement of Afrocentricity and Afrofuturism, but at the same time, I'm making a difference. And so does Kajwa Shun. So there's a bit of a difference. So Afrocentricity, when it looks to revise history, it often valorizes certain things that we might want to take a second look at. Afrocentricity has a large focus on Black male history, for example. It's been critiqued by Black feminists for this reason. It also will valorize like Black pharaohs, and sort of look back at that as like a little bit unproblematically, like everything was great back then. So, and same thing with history of the African continent, right? So as critical scholars, we always want to look critically at any development in human history. We never want to look back at the past with rosy-eyed glasses on, and Afrocentricity is a bit, sort of falls into that a bit, but it does for reasons that I empathize with.
Yeah.
Okay, like there's a historical reason for Afrocentricity to happen within the academy and to continue today. It's like we need that, right? But when Afrofuturism looks at the past, it reinvents the past. It sees it as a space in which history and subjectivity can be reconfigured in a way which is no longer even bound to the grounds of an earthly humanism at all. I mean, there's a much more science fictional, speculative reimagining of the past that entertains all manner of esoteric, occult, conspiracy theory, ancient alien theory. I mean, it's all in Afrofuturism. I mean, Sun Ra was not kidding when he said he was the return of an ancient alien deity. So, I mean, you have to really think about what Sun Ra is. He's the return, he's been here before, he's the return of an ancient alien pharaoh. So not only are, for Sun Ra, black folk not from Earth, right? They're from Saturn, but they once ruled Kemet, like the globe, more or less, harmoniously through principles of harmonious music, which if you know anything, if you ever watch Ancient Aliens on TV, I mean, look at the pop culture around this, right? You know that like there's a lot of interesting investigations of the sound properties of ancient megaliths and monuments. And I'm full of this, by the way. This is all my dissertation too, in footnotes. But there's all these sites around the world that have ancient sonic properties. So I'm very interested in sound and the role of sound here, right? Black sonic culture is not an accident. Okay, sound is a material property of affecting the body. Sound is literally the movement of sound waves. It affects you physically. It can reprogram you. It can reprogram your consciousness. That's what raves do, right? So festivals do, ritual. So this is all like entwined. So Afrofuturism plays with revisionist history in a way. It really opens it up. And it's more cyclical. It looks at ways to revise the past to infiltrate new futures into the present. So often Afrofuturism is understood in a banal way as just like looking straight forward, like it's just futurism, Afrofuturism. And in a way, it's like a misnomer. We don't really have the right word yet. John Jennings has proposed astro blackness, which is why Afrofuturism 2.0, the subtitle is The Rise of Astro Blackness. Like that was his attempt to sort of reconfigure that term. Because Afrofuturism is as much engaged with the past to change the conditions of the present by introducing new visions of the future. So whenever I read a bad scholarly article that critiques Afrofuturism as just being futurist oriented, it's like, it's poor scholarship, and you see this in like press articles often, like the sort of misunderstanding of what Afrofuturism means this way. Yeah. And Damion, you did great work. I mean, you distinguished it from Italian futurism and so forth. Because I mean, I don't want to say there's no relation. There's been a discussed relation, but I mean, the Italian futurists were more or less fascists. I mean, Marinetti's a fascist. He glorified war, violence, technology. It's the antithesis.
Without doubt. And also, although you have the kind of weird quirk of the whole positive, even though it is a stereotypical positive of remember the black wet nurse that's in the Futurist Manifesto with him, looking back in fondness of his, experience as a young person with the exotic blackness of the feminine figure in his memory, right? Which is the only, positive reference that you have to femininity in that one of those foundational documents. And I'm following up on what TOBiAS is mentioning here, everyone, right? What he's partly referring to, right, and if I may, is the practical necessity of what's called Nile Valley Afrofuturism, and the romanticized version of Nile Valley Afrofuturism progressively giving way to conditions that allow for what's called a more pragmatic Pan-African Afrocentrism, and then what further gives way to what often is considered these days in Africana Black study scholarship as just purely pragmatic Afrofuturism. And Afrofuturism itself as a concept has allowed for this transformation of the related concept of Afrofuturism to also expand, grow, change, to transform, to mutate, right? So I would like you guys to really understand, what he's saying here, and the importance of understanding chronopolitics as not only what we call a thin concept, which is describing something conceptually and its logical relations, but also a thick concept that allows us to do stuff, to act, to judge, right, and to engage in political and social practice. I also want to show you guys this, which I had meant to send around last night. I wanted to read it first since it is a work of Afro-pessimism, but on this topic that TOBiAS is mentioning of Black feminism, is this sharing fine? Black feminism and chronopolitics, yeah, it's fine. We have this piece that I'm going to send around, but when I saw Afro-pessimism, I was like, hold on a second, I need to double check, make sure you get, I'm joking, but kind of, there's been this conceptual tension between the ideals or the practices of Afro-pessimism and Afrofuturism. And, I've lived through this much of my life, and also in terms of, as TOBiAS has mentioned, some of the different schools of thought that you get within academia in classes like this, and other classes that were more Afro-pessimistic orientation. But, this piece by M. Shadi Malaklo, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it right, as you can see, clearly is adopting the concept of chronopolitics and using it towards, as we can hear or see, an insurgent Black feminine otherwise. I'll send that around to you guys, but I just wanted to show you, how you have a scholarship that is very specifically using and referring to this concept of chronopolitics, right? Good comment and question, Ruben. Anyone else? Let me unshare that. And actually, please, Brittany.
We talk a lot about the binary when we're talking about Afrofuturism and men and women. And my question is kind of, where do you see the non-binary in Afrofuturism, as you kind of continue reading, writing, and doing your work, because, they exist. And I feel like it's something that we don't talk about enough. So that's my question is, where do you see that in the future as we rewrite the past and rewrite the future as well?
When you're thinking about the non-binary, what does that mean for you? In what context? Trans
people who don't identify as like a man or a woman. They just are people. They, them people.
Here it is. Excellent. This book's so good. Francesca Royster, Sounding Like a No-Now. Queer sounds and eccentric acts in the post-soul era. The language around what became queer theory, non-binary theory, it wasn't actually developed to the same extent when I was writing this. I've since written about this more extensively, but even in the Armageddon Effect chapter, you'll notice a bit of a discussion there around Jimi Hendrix's identity, his sexual identity as being very fluid, as being androgynous, as sort of flowing between male, female. I should write something just on Hendrix because I love Hendrix.
Yeah.
I'm just Hendrix makes me queer. All right. That's what I'm going to say about Hendrix. I got a thing for Hendrix.
What was that, everybody? Third, fourth class? What was it? Values of Neptune. All right. We TOBiAS, they've heard.
Oh, yeah.
Mermaid, I would like to be. I forget the Anthony 3, a mermaid I would like to be coming up. They've heard. Yeah. And you got to see him live. You got to see the concert footage. You have to see his level of performativity, his sexual persona, which is at once masculinist and yet is also incredibly androgynous, and sort of transcending a binary. I would apply non-binary to Hendrix. Yeah.
In terms of his performative persona, his becoming, his alien becoming, and that's where I'm using the real sort of philosophical alien becoming, the sort of Deleuzean idea of ontogenesis, of becoming, of the transformation of self. And and not just Hendrix. Look at Prince.
There you go.
Look, Grace Jones would be huge here. There's a whole chapter on Grace Jones in Francesca's book. I'll provide some links.
I was just thinking about her. Jesus.
Oh yeah, straight up. Oh gosh, the queen. Warm leather red.
Oh, man.
Not perfect. All these classics. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. I would take a second to play some now, but we have a lot of questions.
Yeah. Hold on, I got a quick question. I don't know if you can see me though.
Sorry, one more time?
I got a quick question, but I don't know if you can see me.
We can't.
Yeah.
But we can hear you though.
I was gonna ask about Prince and where you think he stands with Afrofuturism. Because that's a big figure, I would say. I would say he's one of the biggest figures when it comes to Afrofuturism. of all time.
Prince is a big figure, but let's say specifically about Afrofuturistic tropes, Afrofuturistic concepts, Afrofuturistic, kind of aesthetics, Afrofuturistic kind of ideation. Kai, what specifically would you say is futuristic about Prince's persona, Prince's music, Prince's, aesthetic?
I feel like he stood out amongst most people because before, like, you had like Isley Brothers, and you had like all these soul figures that were more like I'm not saying Prince was gay because Prince did get a lot of girls, but Prince was more fluid in the sense that he didn't care how he dressed. He could wear the pants with his butt cheeks hanging out. He could still get all the girls in the world. But I feel like he stood out in the sense that he could dress how he wanted to dress, look how he wanted to look, wear all the eyeliner he wanted, and still do what he wanted to do. Nobody looked at him differently, and people in his circle were the same. So, like, where do you think he stands in Afrofuturism? I mean, it even leads into today because more dudes aren't as, I'm not going to say less masculine, but they have more of like a feminine side of them. Like they have more of an approach where it's like not one set way. They're more fluid in how they come across.
And you can even think very quickly about when Prince changed his name from the artist formerly known as Prince and adopted the symbol. The symbol he adopted is very specifically a non-binary amalgamation of the traditional masculine and feminine symbols. Very good. TOBiAS?
Yeah, and I just want to point out that Prince did that too, so he could get out of his oppressive record contract.
Yeah.
Smart, because that's fighting capitalism. That's fighting the propertization of the self as a recording artist for a structural and systemically racist music industry.
And if you want to
Damn
talk about
straight.
Explicit references, Prince recording 1999 in 1984. And very specifically referencing aspects of ideation of time travel and also, future, unknowability and future knowability in We're Gonna Party Like It's 1999 in 1984. Classic of classics as well. Good question, Kai. Good remark. Anyone else? And especially people, remember, we have questions focused on the article, Armageddon in Effect.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So in the article, it talks about how the apocalypse basically starts with the transatlantic slave trade, like it lists that as the starting point. And from there, that's why we're living in an Armageddon effect. So I guess my question is why that particular event and why not other historical atrocities, I guess, that happened to people in the African diaspora, like why that specific event is listed as the apocalypse or the Armageddon moment.
Would there be another world historical event that you think would nuance this reading or would change our perspective?
I mean, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I guess more so that question popped up to me because I feel like why, in terms of, I guess, African American history, of why it seems to always start as like we're going to start from a slavery standpoint as opposed to pre-slavery or, so yeah.
Interesting.
I have a comment on that question.
Go ahead, Brittany.
Yeah, I do too.
We're living, like the idea or like waiting for the apocalypse or something. We're already living in it. Like for indigenous people, for example, like they're already living in, a post-apocalyptic world. Like the way that they had imagined life and the way their land was and everything they were doing, their politics, everything that they did has been completely obliterated. Or they're hanging on by a thread. Like, for example, the people in the Amazons, like in Brazil, we're already there. I just think that we think that we're not because we're functioning, like we're chilling at the end of the day, like we're at home. Like for some people, like everything is pretty all right. But I think that for others, they're really seeing that happening. Or, I mean, I am seeing it happening. But yeah, that's just my comment on that.
Ruben?
I was just going to say that I guess it's considered Armageddon in the sense that we could try to, I mean, it's almost like you would have to imagine what the life was before the slave trade began, because that history was literally erased at the onset of that event, whether it was, just, it doesn't matter who sold who or how it even happens. Once those people were handed over and taken here, every attempt was made at every turn that even right after the Civil War, even those people couldn't go. There was a lot of go back to Africa movements, but it was go back to what? They had no idea. That was already long, long erased. They had no trace of their lineage, no concrete evidence of where they came from. Every attempt was made to like get, families separated, the idea of even a family, especially of relatives, of community, of any chance to resist, revolt, to uprise. I mean, on more than just the basis of we all look the same, but like, or, of that sort of kinship, and not the kinship of, we actually come from the same people, or, on a closer level, more than just being Black people,
Yeah.
or more than just being from Africa.
Good.
So,
Go ahead, Chanel.
I also had a comment on that question. It was my understanding, going through the years as a Black history major, that it simplifies our existence. And
Good.
it also helps us start off with a lower sense of self. It helps us start off with a lower self-esteem, which is what helps capitalism go around. So if we're seeing like there's all these riches, all these fancy cars, and we literally think all we came from was slaves or enslaved peoples, we're not, on a wider scale, we're not going to go back and be like, well, what were we before then? Like, we in higher education think about that, but status quo people aren't worried about that. They're just like, well, we came from nothing and now we have this and this is what we have to show for it. It takes out a lot of the equation. It keeps it incomplete.
Fantastic question, Shamari, and great follow-ups. Just about 30 seconds before I let TOBiAS address that. Shamari's question is it's very nuanced. There's part of what the question seems to be involved is, are we talking about an event, singular, or events, all right, plural, and all these events together giving us a sense retrospectively, and then also in terms of climate politics, retrospectively now and projectability, right, of some kind of Armageddon that is inherent, intrinsic to us as a people, all right, which is kind of what kind of goes along with what you heard me joking about earlier when it comes to this distinction between kind of more fundamentalist Afro-pessimistic view and perhaps a more, even if it's not Afrofuturistic view, maybe a more Afro optimistic view. And one thing that you've noticed is whenever you do indeed, as Chanel and Shamari has kind of mentioned here, and probably better than I'm phrasing it, when you constantly associate the doom, the gloom, the depression, the sadness, and the anger with Africana existence and Black identity, you do indeed get this idea of, well, hold on a second here. For us in the New World, who are the descendants of this Armageddon, this Holocaust, this genocidal activity, we also have to think of the millions of people who are the descendants of people of sub-Saharan Africa, who were living lives of privilege themselves within their own cultures, in their own histories, in their own geographical locations. African royalty, rich people, people who worked to sell other people who were prisoners of war of the people across the river or across the plains, people who worked with the colonizers, people, this, that, and the other thing, and all the millions of experience that they have. And you have Eshon, without doubt, addressing some of this stuff. There's a white South African art historian, Bigelow, who I refer to in my little unpublished paper you guys have on Blackboard, which she pushes back on this whole concept of Afrofuturism, along with Eshon, as being not so much about Africana identity, but really about Africana diasporic futurism identity. And this is a very important question that Shamari has raised, which is, hey, how about constant references to projecting the future, Black genius, Black joy, Black fun, all right? And that's part of what we're doing here with Afrofuturism is as TOBiAS has mentioned, and as many of the readings have mentioned, this mixing, this pastiche, this collage, this remixing, right? Of not only the tropes and the references, but the affects, the emotions, the feelings that we have. And I think that's a fantastic question, because sometimes you want to say, yo, it's not just like pointing to pharaohs and a couple of figures, whatever. It's in the 1800s. It's in the 1700s. It's in the 12th century, one of the richest men in history, whichever, right? Are also part and parcel of a reconstruction and an authentic identification with sub-Saharan African history, especially Western African history. So fantastic. TOBiAS, if you have anything to add? All right.
You guys are schooling me. I'm really enjoying this discussion.
I told you they were a really, really good group. One of the better classes I've had. I knew, yeah. Okay, everyone good? Shamari, let's go ahead and continue.
I wanted to just quickly drop this so I don't forget. And this is just a brief circle, but Brittany, this is just thinking of your question. I'll give you guys the PDF for this. There's a chapter in Black Speculative Arts Movement by Ronaldo Anderson and I that is Fabulous Camps of the Black Fantastic, Sylvester James, Queer Afrofuturism, and Black Vernacular Becomings. So we look at Sylvester James, who's probably a figure you haven't heard of, but she was the trans disco artist coming out of the San Francisco LGBTQ plus / gay scene in the 1970s and early 1980s. Yeah. So, yeah, I just wanted to gesture.
What's the song? You Make Me Feel Mighty Real. That's the one,
You
right?
make me feel mighty real. Yeah.
Let me go ahead and paste it. Yeah, look, TOBiAS, none of us, even Brittany, I don't think we're going to be able to hit that soprano, all right? Sylvester, I'll tell you, they had, let me go ahead and post the link for people who are not aware. I mean, we only have 50 minutes left, but watch it at your time. I'll send the link around as well. All right, I'm going to post it right now. Anyone else have a question queued up? And I'll go ahead and post it.
You can also give a really interesting queer reading to the Michael Jackson Thriller video if you watch it, the whole thing, beginning to end, very carefully around what Jackson's sexuality, how it's being portrayed within that video throughout, and his production of falsetto. So you can look at a very quote unquote mainstream, not even mainstream Black artist, but the king of pop. Okay, I mean, Michael Jackson, and you can definitely look at him as a non-binary figure.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to paste it in. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, everyone, let's continue. A few more questions. 10 minutes here, and then we can allow TOBiAS to go ahead and,
I just wanted to really briefly, just because that's the whole point of this chapter. The Army, I think you've all described this really accurately, but I mean, the main thesis here is precisely that the Armageddon, the apocalypse, has already happened. And this is a really significant thesis. Like, don't underestimate this thesis and its effects. Okay, you're reversing the entire Western Enlightenment timeline, which is grounded on Christian eschatology. Okay, so that's a big word, like eschatology, but it's this general sense that like we start with the Garden of Eden and like the fall, like we were innocent, and then there's a fall into sin, and we're all born into sin. And then history is this long period of like redemption and struggle leading towards some kind of final event in which the monotheistic Christian deity returns to judge the living and the dead. And this basic schema underlies all of Western philosophy. I mean, Hegel still thinks of history as progressing towards some kind of teleological endpoint, world consciousness. Marx took that and made it pragmatic economically. Okay, we have a series of like class revolutions to determine economic power, and eventually we'll get to a point where the biggest under, the slave class, the proletariat, wrests control, and then we abolish that hierarchy. So again, we have an end of history, like in Francis Fukuyama, right? A termination point. So what I'm fundamentally arguing here is that the end has already begun and happened, and now we're living out its effects. And these effects are like ripple effects that like pulse through history. And this really does disrupt all matter of philosophical systems, preconceptions about what race and structural racism is. I mean, I just wrote a paper for a volume on themes of the apocalypse in literature for a French publisher, And this is kind of messed up, but I'm the only person writing on Afrofuturism and Black perspectives. And in that essay, I just hammered in because every other chapter in the volume is thinking of the apocalypse as something that's going to happen in the future. And they're looking at representations of it within literature. And I specifically read Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower, to be like, the apocalypse is always already unfolding now. Like we, which includes everyone, whatever background you're in, we're living out the effects. Because this apocalypse that not just begins with slavery and capital, but it's also, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution. We're talking about mega technics, like mass industrial planetary engineering. I mean, when I say apocalypse, this is not just a metaphor. Apocalypse means mass death. Okay, apocalypse means we've created the conditions to kill all life. All right, this is serious business, and that is climate change. Okay, climate change, mass slavery, colonization, extermination of indigenous peoples. This is all one gestalt. This is all wrapped together. So, like, Afrofuturism is actually, it's a part of like a bigger discourse here about trying to understand the moment in which we live right now and what we can do about it to mitigate the effects of an apocalypse that began centuries ago.
Yeah, already here and living through it, and then also dealing with, the ramifications. And right now, in the present, most pressing danger in terms of mass genocide and even speciescide would be climate change. The beginning of in consciousness, if you want to go Hegelian, kind of a world consciousness or world historical consciousness in the middle of the 20th century, with the advent of the possibility of nuclear holocaust and the idea of where you have obviously, white majority first world nations who at second, all right, United States and the Soviet Union at the time, with the technological ability to pretty much eradicate much of life on Earth. And then with the first, quote, non-white country developing nuclear weapons in India in the 1960s. But I mean, again, all of this is incredibly salient. And, what we need to be understanding when it comes to Professor Van Veen's sense of Armageddon effect. Very good. 10 minutes to go, anyone? We have a few more questions, one or two more. Anybody, please?
I want to ask like a question. Like, what is Afrofuturism's like essence, and is it about like transforming oppression into a form of superiority or strength? Because like sometimes it feels like it's a level of superiority compared to white people, but at the same time it could be seen as like just being stronger than like your past. So I don't know if it's like one or the other, because like in the movie Spaces of Place, it seems like it's like I'm above you. Like I could just snap my fingers and send my people to Saturn type of thing.
Yeah, there's a bit of that. There's like a reversal. There's like a dialectical reversal of like the role play of that, like Hegel's master-slave dialectic, right? Like Sun Ra like reverses the whole thing. Not only that, but Sun Ra destroys Earth. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm giving away the ending at this point, but you're supposed to have seen the film, right? But the bet that he makes with the overseer is nothing less than Earth itself, and the overseer doesn't believe that Sun Ra would actually wager Earth. And I mean, this is something that I've dwelt upon at length in terms of the way they cut the ending of this film and its meaning, because it's profoundly not attached to Earth. And so if we're looking at the essence of Afrofuturism, we might want to question as to whether it has an essence that would be grounded in Earth, at least from Sun Ra's perspective. There's a sense here that we can actually abandon Earth as any grounds of being, or grounds of being quote unquote human, that we can conceptually, but also like realistically in the future, science fictionally, like technologically, leave Earth. We can exist as otherwise in ways that we have not yet fully discovered yet. And that's the potency of the Black radical imagination, of speculative fiction and science fiction in general, is to imagine those alternatives now, to get a taste of what could be otherwise. I mean, I love Star Trek. It's still not a bad model. for some visions of a radical future. Star Trek is a socialist utopia. There is no money. All right, everyone has to be reminded of this. Yeah, no, this is an interesting question though. So this is really about the relationship between Afrocentricity in its older variants and Afrofuturism, which is Afrofuturism reconstituting Black is king, to put it in Beyonce's terminology. Beyonce is fantastic Afrofuturist. Lemonade, amazing visual album. Dissect that. I'm curious as to everyone's takes on it.
Anybody? Anyone can comment on Lemonade? It's not on the syllabus, but obviously.
Or just this idea of like reversing the dialectic. Yeah.
I mean, not more so not on the Beyonce's Lemonade thing, but like for me personally, my experience with Afrofuturism was super limited before coming into this class. So my only exposure to it was Black Panther. And I remember there being like a lot of discourse once that came out about what if Wakanda was real, what would it look like? And it seemed to be a lot of like Black Americans putting their spin on it. And then there was this whole discourse, like especially on Twitter, there was a whole discourse of Black people from other parts of the diaspora saying, well, Wakanda's not just going to be, what Black Americans are saying that it is. And like, it has to have these other aspects of it. So that was interesting to me. I feel like when we put an Afrocentric view on things, I mean, I guess here as a Black American, like I tend to see it from that perspective only. And I feel like there is a disconnect sometimes where it's not a whole diasporic spin on it. Like it seems everyone just puts it from their own view and then tries to be like, well, that's going to be what it is, as opposed to it's going to be a mixture of Black American identity or Jamaican identity or Brazilian, whatever. But it just seems to be more so people just put it as their own and just put it out to everyone like, this is what it's going to be. Wakanda's going to look like us blasting hip hop all day. And then someone's like, well, I don't listen to that. I listen to this, or I don't eat that. I eat this. Like that whole discourse about what Wakanda would be like if it was a real place was super interesting. And like that's what I thought of when seeing the argument in your article about Afrocentrics and Afrofuturism together.
I believe there was actually a call for papers on an edition literally entitled, I think the quote was, "If Wakanda was real," right, TOBiAS? And like, Ronaldo was involved with that, I believe, something like that.
Oh yeah, you mean the When is Wakanda issue?
Wakanda thing, exactly.
Yeah, Journal of Future Studies, yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
I have a piece in there discussing Black cosplay, actually, in that context.
Really?
Rejected mind. Yeah, you should check it out, Chanel. Yeah. I'll say this to follow up with Flavian's question. We'll be reading an article by, I believe it's Kreis, who talks about, Afrofuturism in relation to the Black Panther Party. And this is Black Panther as the political party from the 60s, predating, obviously. Although, interestingly enough, the Marvel comic comes out just 2 or 3 years before the Black Panther Party is founded and named. But what you have is Kreis describing this kind of dialectic, all right, between the so-called humanistic, Black kind of revolutionary consciousness and a sense of, indeed, a genuine sense of Black superiority, Africana superiority. And with the Black Panthers, what you had was a sense of structural claims, a claim to superiority because of structural claims of being an oppressed, alienated segment of a population, of a society. And this in itself gave the revolutionary cause its justification for claiming some degree of superiority over people who didn't understand, the power of the proletariat, the power of the Black proletariat, and the power of people to overthrow a system. With Sun Ra, what you had was also a similar advocacy for the use of technology with the Black Panther Party, military technology, machine guns and rocket launches, what they were kind of fantasizing about. But Sun Ra, obviously, interplanetary, voyage technology, space rays and whatnot. But with Sun Ra, it was a sense of possible superiority based purely on a sense of failure of humanistic, utilitarian, objective ethics. These people don't understand we're also human, so fuck them, we'll leave, and if anything, I'll blow up the whole fucking place. But with the Black Panthers, it was kind of structural. Like, yeah, it's not just morals. These people think they're better because they have more money. They have more control over the system, this, that, the other thing. But you have this similarity and this disjunction. And this is kind of reflective of this, 18th century, 19th century dialectic of Black agency in terms of our ability to, return if we wanted, and in terms of what your questions were, like what would it be like if we returned. Martin Delany in the 19th century is saying, you know what, I'm going to buy up land, and I'm going to make some nice farmland. We're going to get plots ready for families to come back. We're going to make it great when we return. And the Civil War breaks out, and Delany rushes back on the next ship back to the United States to become a major in the Union Army and meet with Lincoln. But then you have
Professor,
like Douglas. Yes, time.
the way you laid out just now, Sun Ra versus Black Panther, would it
Yeah.
be safe to say Killmonger was sort of the Sun Ra of the movie?
I was going to try to finish with exactly, right? Douglas and Delany, Garvey and Du Bois to a certain extent, or at least Garvey and Tuskegee. People help me out.
Tuskegee Airmen?
No, this Tuskegee Institute founded by
Booker T. Washington.
Booker T. Washington and Garvey, and then developing into King and Shabazz, Malcolm X. All right. The militancy in terms of there is indeed something we should feel some superiority about, versus the superiority is just temporary and we get to what we need, kick it away, and we have that egalitarian humanism again. All right. So very good question. And just to be thinking about it in these terms, in terms of how historically, these different, the dialectic has developed. Listen, we're getting close to time, everyone. All right. We have one more question. And if not, I'm going to compile a list of what Professor Van Veen has mentioned today in terms of music and the literature. I would like all of us to please join in a virtual applause for TOBiAS Van Veen and the fantastic insight he's brought to the class today. Thank you very much, TOBiAS. Absolutely appreciate it. I've got a ton I want to talk to you about it at some point in the future as well. All right. And students, I'll leave it to you and TOBiAS. If you guys have any, last minute things that we would like to say or ask, please feel free.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say first, thank you to you all for your amazing questions. I will make my contact information available. I love when people write me. That's why I'm an academic. So if you have questions, you want to dive into any of this, I'm happy to do what I can. And yeah, this whole question of like superiority, the sort of dialectics here, a lot of my work, the theoretical underpinnings I'm working with here are trying to break dialectics. Okay, like when I talk about alien becomings and alienation, it's specifically, I'm looking at the intervention within a dialectical system, that which breaks the dialectic. Like the idea of white Enlightenment humanism is premised upon Hegel's master-slave dialectic of the slave gaining consciousness of the tools that the master is alienated from, so that then the slave understands the conditions of production and then can use those tools to overthrow the master. Okay, it's the most famous 10 pages in Western philosophy, and it's the basis of like all of Marx and a lot of social theory. That still kind of holds in an interesting way. But when you look at the ontology, the discourse of being that grounds a slave who is excluded from the category of the human, you're looking at a system which no longer fits into a binary dialectic. And so the excluded, subhumanized, enslaved non-person becomes non-human, and thus is no longer even the slave and the master-slave dialectic. They can't even flip it. So when I'm talking about becoming alien, it's like a perforation of the dimension in which dialectics operates. It's almost like multi-dimensional philosophical theory. It's suggesting that becomings proliferate regardless out of dialectical strictures. So I know it's highly abstract. This is where I'm a bit of a philosopher, but my answer is to like the superiority and so forth. I mean, this is definitely taking place as phenomenons that we can talk about within pop culture, and there's a reason for it, and it has its moment, and I like it. But at the same time, I think what we're seeing fundamentally is a rejection of the system itself that would say some humans are more superior than others. Instead, what we're doing is tearing open the field of what it means to simply be on the planet. And should we even call that human anymore? Should we identify with that history of humanism anymore? Is this baggage that we still want to carry on? You know, what other forms of becoming, just like trans and queer theory, like non-binary identification, what other forms of becoming can we enact and have already always been enacted and just been ignored and not properly paid attention to? You know, I think it's all sitting there. For me, there's like a plurality of ways to be and become that already exist. And once these become to be voiced within, these spheres of discussion, though, what we're talking about is an overthrow of Western philosophy as the dominant paradigm by which identity and subjectivity is construed. So
absolutely
grand
fantastic.
imperial claims here, but that's the stakes. Yeah.
I'm going to end on a positive note. I'm not sure if Professor
That's Jeff Mills.
Speaking of Detroit techno, your instructor with the Wizard, second generation Detroit techno master, absolutely Jeff Mills. All right.
Oh,
and
yeah.
doing some stuff. Jeff Mills, this was in 2011 at the Studio Museum of Harlem at his discussion of Afrofuturism. All right, we'll leave with a positive note. And once again, everyone, let's thank Professor Van Veen for this fantastic.
Thank you all.
All right, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks,
You guys,
Professor.
absolutely. So Monday, return to the comment. All right, everybody. Comment, Du Bois, and then we'll also pick up on the Crease article. Okay, everyone? Okay, guys.
Cool.
Tobias, thank you so much. I'm going to email you. I'll be in touch. I'll text you. Okay. Thank you very, very much. So appreciated. It was absolutely
Thank you.
fantastic. All right,
Thank
guys.
you all.
I'll see you guys next
Thank
week.
you.
Okay, everybody. You guys take care. Okay,
There we
check
go.
in. Okay, then.